So The Cure released Wish in 1992, and it would take them 4 years before they followed it up with Wild Mood Swings. And as you might expect, a lot can happen in 4 years. For starters, this was the longest gap between Cure albums at that point. I think that you see this with bands pretty often, where early on in their career, whenever they're first trying to get established, they release albums like crazy, but then as the years pass on by, people tend to focus on the older stuff, and so the newer stuff takes less of an emphasis. Also, by this point, the band were in their 30s roughly. Robert Smith would have been about 36 whenever Wild Mood Swings dropped. And so, of course, as you get older, you settle down, you have families, yada yada yada. And of course, it's always difficult to make a new album whenever you lose members of your band. So in the years between Wish and Wild Mood Swings, the band lost Boris Williams, their drummer, and Pearl Thompson, their guitarist. And both of these individuals contributed a lot to the songwriting process of The Cure, and so of course if two of your major songwriters leave, there's going to be a gap to be filled. And in addition to that, the world of popular music had changed, and the band had already experienced some of that to a certain degree with Wish. Wish dropped in 1992, so by that time the alternative music scene looked very different than it did in the 80s. You had bands like Nine Inch Nails, Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins. You also had Britpop bands, you had Oasis and Blur, and so really by the time that Wild Mood Swings dropped in 1996, everything was different about The Cure. And I think most people, whenever they're talking about the golden period of The Cure, they point to Wish and its tours and say that was kind of when the band stopped being great. Because really, I think in the eyes of most people, Wild Mood Swings is the first bad album that The Cure released. And when this album dropped, it was hated by fans and it was hated by critics. And people have written different retrospective pieces where they've tried to argue that basically this album was only hated because of the time that it came out in. Essentially, a lot of people will try to argue that Wild Mood Swings didn't fit in with the alternative rock stuff, with the grunge stuff. They'll say that because the band didn't sound like Soundgarden or Alice in Chains or Pearl Jam, that was the reason this album failed. And you have a lot of people who look at this album and say, oh no, it's actually some hidden great masterpiece. And I do think that inevitably it is true that this album would have done better if The Cure were more in vogue than they were in 1996. But really, as I've been listening to this album more and more and more, preceding this video, I found myself enjoying the album more, but at the same time, I still don't think it's a great Cure album. But really, I think this record is probably the most difficult thing I've ever had to discuss on this channel, and the reason why is weird. I feel like I'm pretty good at articulating why certain things work and why others don't, but this album is confusing to me. Because for one reason or another, I just find it really freaking difficult to explain why this album doesn't work for me. And obviously it's not just me who didn't like this album, it was also everyone else who listened to it at the time it came out. You know, The Cure went from being these rock superstars to just kind of falling off the face of the earth. I remember reading a line that summed it up this way and said that the band prior to this had no problem selling 50,000 seats in a night. But after this album, they struggled to sell even a tenth of that. They struggled to sell even 5,000 seats a night. And for better or for worse, I think it's pretty normal actually to have a giant pop band, or not even a pop band necessarily, but a giant rock act, to have some kind of big act that is huge, and then all of a sudden they release a bad album and then they just tank. This happened with Metallica, for instance, where they were a huge band and then they released Saint Anger, and it's an album that's still made fun of 20 plus years later. You saw this happen with Fall Out Boy whenever they released Mania. Again, same thing, everyone hated that album, but I don't think it quite destroyed their career. I remember at the time it came out, Reputation by Taylor Swift was absolutely reviled and hated. And I remember the last Panic at the Disco record, Viva Las Vengeance. That album was so freaking bad, and the tour for it sold so poorly that Brendan Urie broke up the band essentially, even though he was the only member of the band. And so the reason I bring up all those other bands is because basically they are examples of what I'm talking about whenever I say that Wild Mood Swings was for The Cure a giant catastrophe. Basically they went from being the cool band to just no one caring. But the thing is that I think that with those albums I just named, I feel like it's pretty easy to sum up why all those records are bad and just say that it's because the artist or the band or the singer or whoever was following trends. With Saint Anger, Metallica was following nu metal trends. Fall Out Boy's Mania felt like it was following the EDM trend to a certain degree. Taylor Swift's Reputation was her trying to seem hard and whatever, like a hip hop album. And then that Panic at the Disco record is kind of weird because it didn't really follow any trends, it was just garbage. But for the most part, whenever someone makes like a really crappy album, like whenever Megadeth made Risk, usually it's because they're trying to chase trends. Usually whenever a band puts out a really garbage album, it's because they're trying to stay relevant. but they can't. But I don't really feel like that was the case with this record. I don't really feel like that was the case with Wild Mood Swings, because with Wild Mood Swings, you have a record that is undeniably The Cure. It's an album that sounds like The Cure, and on paper, it should work. This album is not unlike albums like The Head on the Door, or Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, or Wish. It's not even unlike The Top, for instance. It's a varied record. It has a lot of different sounds. The band go to a lot of different places with this record. You know, you have the jangle pop of Mint Car, you have the the salsa dance of 13th. You have really like sad, heavy Cure songs on there like Treasure and Bear. You have songs about love and longing like Strange Attraction and Jupiter Crash. And those two songs are actually two of the best on the record, by the way. And so this album was never going to be something like Pornography or 17 Seconds or Disintegration. It was never going to be some kind of gothic masterpiece. But really, on paper, it should have been a really great pop album in the same way that The Head on the Door or Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me are. But the thing is that it just does not come together. And this is what I mean when I say that this album is really difficult for me to talk about. It's really difficult for me to explain why exactly it doesn't work. Because there are 14 tracks on this album, and as I'm saying, they all sound pretty different from one another. And so whenever I think about them, I can explain to you how each one sounds. I can tell you what they sound like and what other songs they remind me of. But in some strange way, the album just doesn't leave a mark on me. Whenever I turn the album off, I don't really feel the urge to listen to it again. Aside from a couple songs that I actually do love, like Strange Attraction, I don't care to listen to most of the record. And I think that right there is the best that I can do at identifying why this album doesn't work for me. Just none of the material on here is exceptionally great. Aside from like one or two songs. Like Want is a freaking banger. Want, I love Want. And Want is a really intense track, you know. Robert Smith sings about wanting blood instead of rain. And he sings about just wanting more things, wanting more sex, wanting more drugs, wanting more love. I want to take a trip to the moon. And he seems to want everything, and he wants it all right now. And it reminds me a lot actually of I Do Not Want This off of The Downward Spiral, which is kind of a weird comparison. In terms of lyrical content, I mean, not necessarily the sonic qualities of it. But Want is like classic Cure. Want is freaking phenomenal. And then as I said, I really love Strange Attraction because it tells this really like kind of heartbreaking story in some ways. It essentially tells the story of how this girl has fallen in love with the narrator of the song. And she writes to him from afar and tells him that she wants him. And so in the song, this goes on for months, and finally the girl and the narrator of the song are able to meet up. And then they part ways, and by that point the narrator has actually fallen in love with the girl, but then the girl has fallen out of love with the narrator and realized that he wasn't the person who she thought he was. So that's one of the few songs on this record that I love. And I think it has some interesting backstory to it because of the fact that Robert Smith, being a big famous rock star, had that experience. And I'm sure that to this day, he still has that experience, basically, where people fall in love with him through his lyrics, through his stage presence. They fall in love with him through interviews, and they never meet. And so the song is sort of about that, and it's about how they will interpret his lyrics as being secret messages to them that he doesn't even know that he's broadcasting. And in essence, it's kind of about a parasocial relationship, even though I don't think that that would have been the word that they used back then. But this is a song I really love, and Jupiter Crash I think is a really beautiful one. I think it's a really touching one. Mint Car is kind of fun. It's kind of cheesy. It's a jangle pop kind of tune. It's the closest thing that The Cure ever released to a Smith song. And honestly, it's not all that bad. It's kind of fun. Trap is a decent one. It has a pretty impassioned vocal performance from Robert Smith, and so I think it's a pretty solid like rock and roll style track. And so as I'm explaining, there are actually some really good songs on this record, but the thing is that just nothing about it fits together. And so this is kind of why the record has been frustrating and difficult for me to explain. I know that there are good tracks on the album. I know there are good songs. I can point to the ones that I really like. But whenever I think about the album and I think about my experience with it and I think about the act of listening to it, nothing really sticks. The album doesn't make me feel the same way that something like Faith or Disintegration does. I don't find the pop songs as catchy as a lot of the stuff on Head on the Door. And really, as I'm saying, I feel like there is just a wealth of mediocrity on this record. Nothing really comes together the way that it should. And so really, the album is just kind of a boring experience in a lot of ways. And again, I feel like this doesn't make sense. I feel like me calling it boring doesn't line up with what I've said prior to it, but I don't know how to explain it. If you listen to individual songs in isolation, they're pretty good, but if you put them all together and listen to the track listing through, it doesn't fit. It's just a dull experience. It's just not And I think most people tend to agree that there are issues with the track listing, and Robert Smith himself has said that he's not happy with the final track listing of the album. And so a lot of people have experimented with making their own track listing for the album using B-sides. But the thing is that the B-sides are also, it's the same sort of thing basically, where if you listen to them in isolation, if you listen to one song at a time, you might enjoy it. But whenever you put it together, it kind of blurs. As I said, aside from a couple tracks like Want and Strange Attraction and Jupiter Crash, aside from those, there isn't really that much great standout material. And it's crazy to me because all of the B-sides from like Wish, for instance, make for a better album than this album. If you took the B-sides from the Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me sessions and put them together in an album, that's a better album than Wild Mood Swings is. And so really this album just feels uninspired in a lot of ways, but that's a stupid way to frame it. I think that a better way to say uninspired is it doesn't feel fresh. Like I said, this album feels like a Cure album, and even though they push in new directions, and even though they're doing new things, like the 13th, for instance, which is a salsa song, a lot of people hate it, a lot of people think it's cheesy. I think it's whatever. Mint Car is a jangle pop song. And you did have stuff like Doing the Unstuck on Wish, for instance, that kind of fits in with that more upbeat, happy sort of thing. But overall, Mint Car sounds kind of unique. But even though you have these different sounds, it's just that the album never comes together quite as it should. It feels like with almost every track on here, it feels like it needed more time in the oven or something. Or I don't know, there just should have been a new batch of songs written. Because as I keep on saying, and I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, there's a lot of stuff on here that's good, there's a lot of stuff that's decent, it's enjoyable enough in the moment, but just most of it doesn't have any staying power, most of it doesn't stick in your head. And really, even though it's called Wild Mood Swings, I still feel like The Head on the Door is a more varied record than this one. I feel like The Top is more varied than Wild Mood Swings. But yeah, this album just doesn't work for me, and anytime I've messed with the B-sides, anytime I've messed with the track listing myself and tried to make it work, just nothing fits together. And so it does make me sad to talk about this record in this way because, as I said, I enjoy this album a lot more than I once did. But still, in spite of that, it doesn't work for me. And again, as I keep on saying, that's what's so frustrating about it, is it's really difficult for me to put it into words and to feel like I have properly explained myself. But all in all, this record came out, and it was a bad time for The Cure. The Cure toured it on the Swing Tour, and this tour didn't go particularly well. The band put on some really bad performances during it. Robert Smith was obscenely incapacitated during parts of it. And all in all, the band just, it was not a good time to be a Cure fan, I guess. And I think that Robert Smith and The Cure knew this. I think they knew that they had fallen off. And so after the release of this album, Robert Smith put out a second singles collection for the band, Galore. That album contains tracks from Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Disintegration, Wish, and Wild Mood Swings. And it was the band's second compilation because their first one was Standing on the Beach, Staring at the Sea. It goes under a couple different names. And that compilation's freaking great because it includes stuff from 1979 to 1985, The Head on the Door. And so even though the first compilation covers a shorter time frame than the second compilation, it still feels like the first compilation has a lot more varied stuff on it. And so this second compilation, Galore, has never really worked for me in any capacity whatsoever. The band did record Wrong Number, which is actually a song I love. It's super cheesy and silly and goofy, but I love it. It's just a really silly pop track, and Reeves Gabriel worked on it, and he was the guitarist for Bowie at the time, but in the years since then, he has actually joined The Cure. And so at the time of recording, I think he's been a member of the band for like 10 or 15 years. And also, it would have been about this period, the band recorded a track for the X-Files soundtrack, and I kind of love it. More than this kind of sounds like a 90s club song. It sounds like Ace of Base, but I dig it. It's kind of groovy. Want, as I mentioned, is one of the best tracks on this album. It is the best track on the album. And so the band does play it live regularly at this point in time. And Robert Smith did do a remix for this song, the Time remix in 2018. I really like that remix a lot, if for no other reason than because of the fact that it emphasizes just how good Robert Smith's vocals sound on that song. And I think that song actually helps me to recognize what exactly I find about the rest of the album to be so lacking, which is just that there's not a lot of intensity on the record. And when I say intensity, I don't even mean negative feelings necessarily, because there are sad tracks, you know, there are things that could be interpreted as more gothy. As I mentioned, Bear and Treasure and Numb is pretty good, but they're not intense in the same way that like Prayers for Rain is, or the title track off Disintegration. They're not intense in the same way that Faith or Pornography are. And then with the pop tracks on this album, it just doesn't feel like there are very many intense earworms in the same way that something like Just Like Heaven is. And so that's why this album feels mediocre to me. I don't think that the band were just going through the motions, but I do think that's kind of ultimately what the record sounds like. I know part of the reason why this album is kind of a mess is because of the fact that they didn't have a drummer locked in for the album, and so they just were going through different drummers every week. But really, I don't know if I believe that any of the raw material on this album would have been great. I don't know if there was any saving this album. So far as rankings go, this is my least favorite Cure record, at least for now. This is going straight to the bottom. I'm ranking it as worse than the self-titled record, because the thing is that there are tracks that I think are objectively better on this album than on the self-titled record. I think this album has better production for sure, but I think the self-titled record is a much more interesting experience. And it's absolutely flawed, but I would rather listen to the self-titled record than listen to this album, just because the self-titled record is kind of doing something weird. It's a more engaging listen, if for no other reason than because of that. Yeah, this album just, it doesn't work for me. It just doesn't leave a mark, and it makes me sad to say that. As I said towards the beginning, a lot of people say that the reason this album failed was because of the fact that the Cure weren't in vogue. The Cure weren't cool in 1996. And sure, I think there's some truth to that, but at the same time, I don't think that explains why this album is not enjoyable now. This album is almost 30 years old, and so I like to think at least, that if it were actually some secret great record, then it would have been reevaluated and rediscovered by now. I think that if it were actually some secret great masterpiece that was simply blasted because of the time period it came out during, then I think that it would have been, I think it would be seen differently now. There are plenty of records that were hated whenever they came out that are beloved now. You know, Pornography is an instance of that. Pornography was not well received by critics whenever it came out, but people freaking love it now. And there's a reason why it's number 2 on my ratings list and why it's freaking staying there. And so I don't think that it dropping in 1996 is the reason why this album doesn't work. I think that all in all, it's just not a very good album, and I guess that's okay. It was the band's 10th record, and so, I mean, if you can make 9 freaking solid, if not masterpiece records before releasing, you know, kind of a blunder, then like, that's pretty good. But yeah, if I were alive in 1996, then I would not have been listening to this record. There were like so many other better albums coming out during this period. The Downward Spiral would have come out 2 years before. Antichrist Superstar came out in 1996, I think. Metallica would have been in their Load Reload period, and those albums aren't as good as the 80s stuff, but they're better than this album. I don't really like Pantera, but like, I like Pantera more than I like this record. I'm not super huge into Soundgarden, but I like Soundgarden more than this record. If it were 1996, the Foo Fighters' first record would have been out by now. Weezer, their first 2 records would have been out by now. Green Day would have been big by now. So all in all, just nothing about this record is really great. And yeah, I don't think there's any saving this one. As I said, there was a 4-year gap between Wish and Wild Mood Swings, and after the release of this record, there will be another 4-year gap between Wild Mood Swings and Bloodflowers, which we'll talk about next time. So if you have any strong opinions about this album, drop them below, or if you have any strong opinions about Bloodflowers, feel free to drop them below. I have many strong opinions about Bloodflowers for what it's worth. So thank you for watching, and have a nice night. So, bye.